I'm John Canzano. You can read me at johncanzano.com. He is Jon Wilner. You can find him at wilnerhotline.com. We are here with an all-new episode of Canzano and Wilner, the podcast. Jon Wilner, how you doing, buddy? It's Rivalry Week.
It's Rivalry Week. I had to remind myself that it's still September, right? It should be Thanksgiving right about now. You're going to a civil war where it's not even fall.
How was your Thanksgiving?
That's right.
That's what I should say.
That's right.
Oh man.
Exactly. What is it like up there? What is the vibe in Portland with this huge game just so weirdly timed?
Yeah, I think it feels a little weird. I do think there's a strange advantage to a couple of these teams. We'll get into that in a minute, by the fact that this game is happening in week 3 instead of, happening in November. There may be a little advantage there. Also, I think, once maybe Wednesday hit, I think that it started to feel like this is a real rivalry game week. The players and coaches getting asked about it, talking about it. This game's sold out. The Civil War game is sold out. Apple Cup still has lots of tickets. We'll get into that as well and why there are tickets. But it feels like football season, and it feels like a really important game for everybody involved. All 4 of the Pacific Northwest teams undefeated. All 4 of them playing with big stakes this weekend.
They are. So the interesting thing too is for Oregon and Washington, the impact on their seasons, trying to stay undefeated, potentially get in the playoff, all that kind of thing. That's far bigger to them than the rivalry itself, which is far bigger to Washington State and Oregon State.
Yes. And think about it. Jed Fish takes over this Washington program, and he's up against this week Washington State that has a lot of returning players, a lot of continuity. And Dan Lanning's got 11, 12, 13 transfers that could start out of the 22. And those guys are really struggling, and we saw it in the first 2 weeks, to find chemistry. And even though Oregon State's got a new coaching staff, I kind of feel like if you're Oregon State and Washington State, this is the time to play these two schools. You don't want to be playing Oregon and Washington, in November when they're at, they're going to be better. They've ironed out some of these issues. So I think it's a little bit of a silver lining that this game is happening early for the 2 underdogs.
No, great point. Great point. What do you think? How would you classify success for the Beavers? Do you think they have to win for these games to be successful for them?
No, I don't think they have to win. I think the stakes, Oregon, Washington probably are asking themselves that question. But I don't think Oregon State has to win this game to have a successful season. Oregon State bowl eligibility would be a successful season. Oregon State's never going to say that a moral victory is enough for them to be in this game. But I think if it's a real football game, it would be a very different story than everybody thought all summer long. I mean, I heard at Big Ten Media Day, a national media member say that Oregon's going to be able to name its score in this game. Doesn't feel that way. Spread opened at 20.5 in the summer. I think, it's at 18.5, 18 now. I think a lot of people are expecting that it should be down around 14, given how Oregon's played. But I think if Oregon State, stays in this game, they'll never say that. But I think if they stay in this game and they're bowl eligible at the end of the season, they're going to look back and go, hey, it was a successful season. We didn't get run off the field. Look at all the change we had. And we hung in there and played, punch for punch with Oregon.
Yeah. Just look like they belong. Yeah. Both schools, the Cougars and the Beavers. They're playing Power 4. I know we had Scott Barnes on last week, and he was terrific, and he was insistent that there's not a Power 4, there's a Power 5. But certainly Washington State and Oregon State want to show they belong at the level of the Big 12, ACC, Big 10, SEC, right? I mean, is it an audition? It in a little way. I don't think the score is going to have a direct impact on what happens to them with their futures, but certainly it will help them if they win, or, if these games are close in the fourth quarter and it looks like, there's people see it and think, those are 2 power conference teams, even though they got left behind.
Yeah. And I think, look, I've been joking around about Oregon. They start as the number 3 team in the country. They win, they drop. They win again. They drop. Wilner, they're like 3 wins away from being out of the top 25. Like it's just, the vote, nothing that Oregon does is good enough for the AP voters, even though we look back to last year and we see Washington, winning games and winning ugly, that win it advanced. I kind of think like college football today looks more like the NFL in that, like the Chiefs last year, they lost 6 games. They were in the middle of the season. They didn't good. And then they put it together. So I'm really curious to see if Oregon can put it together. A lot at stake for Oregon because, even though I think the CFP is going to be forgiving with the expanded playoff, I think you can have 2 losses and hold your head high and be a playoff team. You don't want to give one up early, knowing that you have Ohio State, Michigan, Wisconsin, and others down the road. But I think you're right. I think if Oregon State can stay on the field, look like it belongs, that's a great way to put it. I think that that's a win for the Beavers in a weird way. They're never going to say it, but being bowl eligible and looking like they belong on the same field as the school that ditched the conference is a big one for them. And simultaneously, Washington State, who I think has a better chance to win the game outright, I'm not concerned about them looking like they belong. I just think Washington State, there's a lot of emotion in that Apple Cup, Wilner, and they can't let the emotion of that be a negative, right? You have to channel it in a very focused way. And I've seen it done both ways. Seen teams that lose focus, lose composure, becomes a bad thing. I'm sure Jake Dickert is focused on like harnessing that emotion this week because it is going to be a very emotional weekend, I think, for Oregon State and Washington State in particular. I'm not sure how much Washington and Oregon and their players, they'll say that they tune into the rivalry. They know what it is. But I need to see it. I need to see that they understand what the rivalry is. And I kind of wonder if the Washington State and Oregon State kids get it more.
Certainly there's that, dichotomy between the huge emotion for the Beavers and the Cougars and then the edge in personnel that the Huskies and Ducks have, right? They've got, if you're picking 2 deeps, you pick Washington's 2 deep over Washington State, and you pick Oregon's 2 deep over Oregon State. But the emotion is very different. You're right about that. And how much, because of the timing of the game, the fact that they're in September and not the end of the season, how much of the Oregon State or Oregon and Washington players just looking at it like a normal non-conference game, right? As opposed to a rivalry game because of where the calendar falls. That's going to have a huge impact, I think. This is Super Bowl. It's Super Bowl like times 10. For the Beavers and Cougars, I think.
Yeah, and you're right about kind of the personnel. I'm watching Oregon closely in the first couple of weeks of the season, and I'm sure Oregon State's coaches on film are going, look, at any given moment, Trayshawn Holden goes 59 yards for a touchdown, or they take a punt 70 yards for a touchdown, or a kickoff return that goes 99 and a half, and the guy drops the ball on the half-yard line, but Oregon gets a 100-yard score out of that. Oregon has that big play capability. They have the capability anytime one of their 5-star guys touches the ball to go to the house. Oregon State is built differently. Oregon State's got to go station to station. I thought it was really interesting. I had one of my stat guys take a look at third downs in particular because Oregon State is like in the top 10 nationally on third down conversion. And what's happening, Wilner, is Oregon State's getting 3rd and 1, 3rd and 2, 3rd and 4. Against San Diego State, like 80% of those third downs, it was third down and less than 5. And so they're putting themselves in a great position, staying in front of the chain, so to speak. And, they're wearing teams out. Now, the opposition has not been like groundbreaking. It's Idaho State and San Diego State, but Oregon State fans who went into the season kind of thinking, where do we belong in college football? Got a message in the first 2 weeks that, hey, you're above the FCS, you're above the middling Big Sky, or excuse me, Mountain West Conference teams. Now they're going to get a real litmus test. Like, where are you in comparison to a team that a lot of people think would make the playoff this year?
Should we get into what the games that we think this week, week 3?
Yeah.
Most intriguing games.
Let's do
Biggest games of the week.
Sure, let's do it. Which games? Let's do our top 3 big games. Give me your top 3 big games.
Well, I think for me, the Apple Cup is number 1. By the way, that is 12:30 on Peacock. So it is streaming only. And that's because they wanted to put a little background. They wanted to put it on NBC. as the 4:30 broadcast television game, the third game in the Big Ten's triple header. Fox at 9, CBS at 12:30, NBC at 4:30. They wanted to go on at 4:30, but there's a Mariners game. And apparently you can't have a game at Lumen Field and a Mariners game at the same time. And there's a Mariners game at like 6 o'clock. So I was told they would try to get the Mariners to move their game. They did not. So the Apple Cup had to get put on at 12:30, and the slot there is Peacock. So it is streaming only. I'm sure that is not very popular in the western half of the state of Washington, but just wanted to point out that little TV note there. But
yeah, let me hit on that a little bit. I mean, because Oregon fans went through this last week with Peacock.
Yes.
There were a lot of glitches with the broadcast. The audio wasn't matching the video. A lot of problems with buffering and people complaining that some of that happened during the NFL game, but it was really bad for the Oregon game. Now Peacock says they're addressing it, they're looking into it, but they're having some problems, and they had some problems last week. And in addition to the fact that there are just some people who are not comfortable streaming, those who were able to stream it encountered some glitches, and the screen would go black, and it was pretty frustrating for a lot of Duck fans. So we'll see, did they get it figured out in time for the Apple Cup? Yeah,
because if that game were on broadcast TV, it would do really, really well. I think that there's a lot of interest nationally, or even if it was on cable, a lot of interest nationally.
Let me give you my number one game too, because we'll just go back and forth. One, two, because I don't think we're going to agree with all of these, but we agree on the Apple Cup, and I agree with you. I think it's the most important game. I think it's the potential for the biggest upset of these rivalry games. I think, I really like Washington State, how they're built. Wayshawn Parker, John Mateer, Jake Dickert. He's been saying all the last year and a half, we belong. Yep. Beat Wisconsin twice. Here's an opportunity now in the face of the rival who caused you some pain last August to prove that you actually do belong. And so I think this one is huge. Big spotlight on the Apple Cup. What's your number 2 game of the week?
My number 2 game is the Civil War, and we're still calling it that, right?
Yep.
I don't think Washington or Oregon State's got the same chance to win that Washington State does, and certainly the point spread reflects that. But again, you got to show you belong, and it's not. To me, there's also a little bit more of an intrigue about Oregon because of how poorly they have played or how mediocre they've been, right? So it's not just. I thought initially when season begins, I'm thinking, can Oregon State stay on the field? Now I'm thinking Oregon State can stay on the field. Can they win? And if they do win, or if it's close, what's that saying about the Ducks? They're still not getting it right. And that Ohio State game is coming up quick now, all of a sudden, right? It's just like 4 weeks away. Jonathan Smith's coming into town in 2-3 weeks as well with Michigan State. So I'm now interested in both sides of that game because of how Oregon's looked the first 2.
Yeah. And I think beyond that, you're looking at, we'll get into some of this later, but the Pac-12 trying to put together a 2025 schedule.
Yeah.
And, if I'm a TV partner, seeing that the Beavers can stay on the field with the Ducks and seeing that, the Apple Cup could potentially be an upset and draw a big number on Peacock, that kind of stuff matters to those 2 Pac-12 schools. So staying in those games, or maybe one or both of those teams winning those games, would be huge for the Pac-12. I don't have the Civil War as my number 2 game, and Duck fans and Beaver fans are going to be mad at me, but I get what you're saying. I think, it tremendous impact. My number 2 game is Colorado State.
Oh,
I think there's a chance here that the wheels are coming off at Colorado. I don't feel like I'm out on a limb there, but if Colorado State wins this game, it's not just going to be blaming the offensive linemen and, did Shedeur walk to the locker room too soon? I think we'll see what we saw down the stretch last year at Colorado, where you really start to see a team fracture. And, the coaching staff at Colorado last year, have made a bunch of changes in the play calling. Nobody wanted to be on that staff at the end of the season. So I'm thinking, bigger yet than Oregon State is this Colorado State game nationally. What's going on with the Buffaloes and Coach Prime? I think that's a really big story.
It is. And last year's game adds to the interest too. That was double overtime in Boulder. That was one of the best games of the whole season.
Yeah.
Did blockbuster ratings. I'm sure there'll be a lot of eyeballs on this one. I think this is an CBS game. And the fact that Colorado State played them so close last year, they're not going to be intimidated at all. If they had 17 penalties and still almost won that game. So I think there's a lot of intrigue there too. And just from a pure math standpoint, if the Buffs lose and they're 1-2 going into Big 12 play, it is going to be hard to get to a bowl game.
Yeah.
Because they drew in the Big 12 schedule rotation, they drew all the good teams. And so if they're 1-2, they got to go 5-4. I don't know if they can do it. And then you start wondering, all right, what is, is Deion's blueprint for winning, just flawed because of all the transfers?
Well, look, I talked to a lot of the Pac-12 coaches from the original Pac-12, like the 10 departing schools. And I had one coach tell me that last week, even before Colorado played Nebraska, I said, what do you think is going to happen to Colorado? And the coach said, he's not a good coach, pointing to Deion. Said, look at where he was last season, in front of the Oregon game. He was on the sideline at the Bronco game. He was out doing everything but game planning and prepping his team. And so that stuff matters when you don't win. It matters the winning. I thought it was really interesting on the pick 6 that Shedeur threw in the first half of that Nebraska game. You generally will see the offensive lineman or a receiver or somebody, a back, that will walk over to the quarterback as he's leaving the field after throwing a pick 6, pat him on the helmet, say, hey, keep throwing, keep playing. We're in this. We'll get it. We'll get that back. I watched Shedeur after that play. He throws the pick 6. He stands there in disbelief, kind of watches it happen. His offensive linemen all turn and walk. Nobody came over to him. Nobody, he walked all the way to the sideline. And so I feel like there's already some problems there that probably makes sense when you talk about what the focus of that team is. And is it about winning, or is it about branding and marketing certain players on that team? And I just think this Colorado State game is big. What's your number 3 game of the week?
Number 3, I've got Arizona at Kansas State. This is a Friday night game on Fox.
Yeah. And
it is a non-conference game because it was, the schools went under contract for this home and home series in like 2016, 2017. So Arizona was playing Kansas State on the road before Arizona joined the Big 12. The easiest thing to do, just count it as a non-conference game. So it won't count in the Big 12 standings. But to me, it will tell us everything we need to know about whether Arizona is capable of competing for the Big 12 title, because Kansas State's good and it's tough circumstance. Short Friday road games, always hard. I'm very interested to see how Brent Brennan and his team do, because I think it's going to just provide a lot of insight into the rest of their season.
Yeah, I'm really curious to see too, like the Pac-12 teams that have scattered off into other conferences, 21-2 in the first 2 weeks of the season. Last week we saw a similar matchup with Utah and Baylor. It was a non-conference matchup, but the Pac-12 teams all playing very well, all proving, Wilner, that it was never the product. The problem was not the product, but we knew that. My number 3 game, I'll go back. It's the Civil War for me, the number 3 game. And I did just think it's so big. You got, Oregon playing for respect, playing to stay in this college football playoff race. Haven't looked impressive. They made a change on the offensive line in the second half last week against Boise State that seemed to help a little bit. Dylan Gabriel has not looked comfortable at quarterback. Yep. He's getting his center pushed back into him. He's not a big giant guy. And so it's a real problem as a quarterback trying to get comfortable when your center is coming back into you on a pass play. Oregon flipped around, took a guard, moved the guard to center, brought a new guy in. So guard, center, guard, they went with a different rotation in the third quarter. They ran the ball better. They looked better. Now, are they going to stick with that? Did they find something, or do they still have problems on the offensive line? Because that is where their issue has been. I feel them getting a little pass happy, and Dylan Gabriel doesn't look comfortable. So very important for Oregon to get comfortable in this game, get back on track. And then for Oregon State, they're playing for, complete respectability and that whole look like you belong mentality. They're at a stadium where they've had tremendous success. Last year, they had a 2-point loss to Washington. 2 seasons ago, a 3-point loss to USC. Other than that, they have been perfect at home. They beat Oregon at Reser Stadium 2 years ago. It is sold out. They had standing room only tickets available. They're sold out now. So place is going to be rocking. And so I will put that as my number 3 big game of the week.
Yeah, that absolutely. Well worth it. I did notice Oregon has allowed 7 sacks in 2 games.
Yeah.
All of last season, they allowed 5. All of the season before that, they allowed 5. So, if it's not working up front, everything else kind of falls by the wayside.
And they're missing Bo Nix. Let's face it.
True. Good point.
Like, it's hard to tell, Wilner. Like, we thought Dylan Gabriel's going to come in. I think a lot of people thought, oh, pencil him in for Bo's numbers, 4,500 yards, 45 touchdowns. Now we're looking at that and we're going, that's unrealistic. Like, he's not Bo Nix, but kind of wondering Bo Nix, then his center, Jackson Powers Johnson. He gets drafted high by the Raiders, and Bucky Irving drafted right up the middle, like a baseball team. It's like losing your catcher, your shortstop, and your center fielder. I mean, they are now trying to figure it out. I think they will. But if you're Oregon State, you're getting them at a point where like Oregon's wobbling a little bit. And I think Oregon's looking ahead on the schedule going, hey, bye week ahead. Then it's the UCLA, Michigan State. Then it's Ohio State. So the schedule is friendly for Oregon, but Oregon's got to get on track. And Oregon State's job is to keep Oregon wobbling.
Yep. What we should get into your reporting on the Pac-12 Mountain West situation. Don't you think? You did some nice work. That was a couple of days ago, I think, right? On what happened with the scheduling arrangement for 2025. They let that option, the deadline pass. So they're Washington State and Oregon State right now. They've only got half schedules for 2025. What did you fill us in on exactly what you figured out? Well,
there's some friction clearly between the Pac-12 and the Mountain West. And, it starts with the Pac-12 saying, look, we don't want to continue this scheduling partnership. And some of the Mountain West schools didn't want to play the partnership either. And so there's a divide there. They're far apart. They're not coming back together. So the Pac-12, I'm told, has now been, they explored alliances, they explored partnerships. Wilner, I'm told they're now working with Dave Brown, the scheduling guru who, fixed college football scheduling during the pandemic. And, he can sort of scheme his way out of anything. He's a savant with putting schedules together.
Former
Dave
ESPN
Brown
guy.
Yeah. He 28 years at ESPN. He was doing it, making games for ESPN. Now he's, working for the schools, but they've hired him. He is helping them put schedules together. And I'm told they're not having a hard time with this, that they have some real viable options. Both schools feel like they're going to have schedules that are, a little better opponents than this season even. So a little more power 4, power 5, depending on who you ask, flavor to it. I'm told that Oregon State's schedule may have a little more ACC flavor. And so that got me looking at, who in the ACC needs a game. And granted, Dave Brown doesn't need that. He can swap games. He's proved that. He did it this year with Texas Tech going to Washington State and Boise moving their game up. And so, but Stanford's got a couple of openings, Wilner. And I would not be surprised to see Stanford involved in this. Oregon State already plays Cal. Could they play both Bay Area schools in a move that helps Stanford with some travel? And then, Scott Barnes told us in the podcast last week that after they get the schedule complete, they'll go to market. And, I have to think the CW is the most viable and likely primary TV partner. But, I'm being told that this is the contracts are getting formalized. They're getting signed. Would not be surprised to see something happening in the next couple of weeks where we get like, hey, here's some scheduling for 2025, because what these two schools really want to do right now, in addition to, putting together the best possible schedule they can put together, is they want to get it out early. They want their coaches, their recruits, everybody to see what they're doing. And frankly, they're not having to pay the Mountain West $14 million for 12 games anymore. I think they're going to get better games. I think they're going to get better opponents. I think they're going to pay less for them. And I think the CW is probably going to salivate over the idea of having, not lower tier ACC games, but maybe some really good matchups involving Oregon State, Washington State, some of the ACC schools, and maybe not some of the ACC schools.
Yeah, and because they already have a contract with the ACC, there's a lot of synergy there with marketing and cross promotion. So real interesting. I do wonder, what is the long game for the Mountain West here? Because in the summer of 2026, Washington State and Oregon State have to be part of a conference of at least 8. But at the same time, the Mountain West TV deal ends in the summer of 2026. Those two things happen at the same time. And I'm trying to figure out, is the Mountain West taking a little bit of a hardline stance? Is it possible there'll be repercussions for that later on? What is your read on kind of the long game here?
Well, yeah, I mean, absolutely. The Pac-12 schools are having some trouble trying to get Mountain West schools to get permission from the conference to schedule them after the first 3 weeks of the 25 season. So, there have been, Dave Brown, the scheduling guys, trying to get a couple of these Mountain West schools to play. And Gloria Navarez, the Mountain West commissioner, is saying, hey, per our policy, we first assign our games and then we allow our schools to schedule. And so there is a little bit of a hard line. Now, the Pac-12 is rolling their eyes at that, of course, because they know that, you could very easily just go, yes, we're going to do the nice thing, the cordial thing, the collegial thing, and we'll let you have week 8 or week 10, if you want to play Boise State or somebody in there. So yeah, I think there could be repercussions. I also think, look, we have both said the Pac-12 has till the summer of 26 to get to 8. What if they go to the NCAA and go, hey, we need 1 year. We need a waiver of 1 year to get one more year. It helps them even more because it gives them a little more flexibility. They already have the CFP money locked down. If they're not having trouble scheduling, what's the harm in floating along another year and waiting to see what kind of chaos is out there? That you did a really nice job of pointing out Scott Barnes openly rooting for chaos, right? That chaos is the friend of the Pac-12. So I think you could see the Pac-12 try to slow play this a little, get a waiver for a year. And I definitely think maybe their plan is, Wilner, if they don't want 5, 6 Mountain West schools, what if they only want 2? Maybe their plan is, get a waiver and try to peel away 1 or 2. And then now you're scheduling as a pod of 4 instead of a pod of 2. There's some flexibility here that we haven't seen before in college athletics that may be an advantage to the Pac-12 instead of a disadvantage.
And Barnes said last week on the podcast too, right, that they have budgeted for 3 years with the Pac-12 assets, which I thought was really interesting. I had all along been thinking they need 2 years of money because by 2026, they have to be part of a conference. But he said they budgeted for 3 years. So that does give them potentially some optionality to get that waiver. And you go to the NCAA and you basically say, since all this happened to us in the summer of 2023, there's this $1 billion antitrust lawsuit. Everything is changing. Can we get a little just 1 year dispensation here? Maybe the NCAA would approve it, right? They're not, they're losing in court so often. They just ought to approve anything anybody asks for these days. But they do have the money for that 3rd year. That's an interesting piece to it.
And then you throw on top of it, I mean, who knows what value the CW will assign to these games in 25, or can you make better games, and can you create a media rights package that gives you a little bump? And then, I also reported that the Pac-12 has hired, Chicago-based consulting firm Navigate, where, people in the business are very familiar with AJ and Navigate and, how effective that organization can be behind the scenes. I thought it was a really shrewd, smart thing for the Pac-12 because they'll get a real handle on what is their value, what is the strategy moving forward. What did you think of that move, Navigate coming into the room?
Smart, because they can't afford to screw this up. And the other piece is Washington State lost athletic director Pat Chun to Washington. Washington State President Kirk Schultz is retiring. I just feel like they needed some institutional knowledge, so to speak, in some regards, right? People who know the landscape, and Navigate has worked with a whole bunch of conferences, and they know how all the chess pieces are fitting on the board. So in that regard, I think it's real smart. It kind of gives the Cougars and the Beavers, a pathway into what's happening across the terrain. I also do think, though, like the Mountain West I think it's a little bit risky for them to be taking any kind of hard line.
Yes.
Pac-12. I really do. Yeah. The Mountain West, it's not exactly a model of stability, right? I don't think, my opinion only, I don't think that the top 4 or 6 football schools in the Mountain West are interested in sharing revenue equally with the bottom 6 once their new TV deal starts. So, we'll have to see how everything breaks down in the next, what did Scott Barnes say, by the spring? They got to have it figured out by the spring. Yeah. So we got about 6 months, 8 months.
Yeah. And that's just to figure out your path, right? I mean, so you just kind of get your eyes set on a path. And, Navigate helped Oregon, or Oregon hired it prior to moving to the Big Ten. Gonzaga hired Navigate. A few of the conferences have hired Navigate.
Oh, yeah.
They have had their eyes and their fingerprints on a lot of this stuff that goes on behind the scenes. So really smart. It was the first sign I've really seen that, I've been all over them. Branding. How are you working on your branding? Well, they're spending money here behind the scenes. I'm good with that. If you're spending it with a company and a consultant that can really help you, and you point out, that's a great point you make, that, they've lost so much and you don't want to lose kind of your direction. So I think it's great to have somebody else in the room. And then you look at the Pac-12, the conference office has shrunk. Yep. It's not like you have a bunch of deputies who can be lieutenants and help you with this stuff. So I think for Teresa Gold, she gets, a consultant who is battle tested and can help, even as ideas come up, just basically say, hey, no, that's not a great idea. Or yes, this is a good idea. I think the Pac-12 needs all of that. I agree with you on the Mountain West. I just wonder how many of those Mountain West schools really add value. Like, yes, San Diego State, you get Southern California, Boise, football brand. UNLV is interesting to me with Vegas.
Sure.
I start to now really start to hem and haw as we talk about Fresno State, Colorado State, and what happens, is it just 5 or, and do you stop there if you're the Pac-12? That's why I kind of think buying yourself another year helps you sort of scout that out as well. And then, if you can schedule, you're not having a problem scheduling in football, and you can find an alliance for your other sports and find a home for your other sports.
Yep.
Not the worst thing to float a little bit here and see if you can buy a year.
Absolutely. I'm sure we will be back to this topic, I'm sure, at some point in the future here. It is not going away anytime soon. Can we
hit a little bit on something you brought up earlier?
Oh, sure.
The Fox football Fridays are coming onto the horizon. You mentioned one, the Arizona K-State game that's taking place.
Right.
What do you think Friday is going to look like? What do you think, that time slot and that Friday window is going to be for the Big Ten and Fox and others?
So they've got a Big 12 game this week, Arizona at Kansas State, and then starting next week, it is Big 10 on Fridays. And part of Fox's strategy, I'm going to be writing about this in depth this week, but part of Fox's strategy is that they also have Big Noon. So you've got a good game on Friday night, and then you can market your Saturday morning game, your Big Noon game, which is always a blockbuster. So Fox is basically owning college football, for 18 hours, essentially. So I think that's part of what they wanted to do. There's also going to be college basketball on Fox on Friday nights with Big 10 and Big 12. That'll be real interesting. Better than, I don't know what show Fox is putting on at 9:00 Eastern on a Friday night, 9:00 Pacific on a Friday night. But it whatever it is, somebody can just, watch it recorded. But the other thing that is really interesting to me is I think it's part of a bigger move toward putting sports on every TV window of the week, right? We're going to start to see live sports on broadcast television on weeknights. You know, we're going to start to see it on weekdays. The Olympics, I think, opened the eyes for a lot of network executives because the daytime Olympics rated very well. And live sports is better than anything else you can put on except for news. So I think over time, we're going to see this Fox move to Friday night for college football as just part of this bigger shift in how the networks program with live sports.
Yeah, I think a couple things jumped out at me. One is I think Fox has got better matchups, not just on Friday night, but potentially in some Saturday night windows because they got the West Coast schools. You know, they got the 4 schools from the West Coast with the Big Ten, and they've got some of the Big 12 schools that came, you know, like Arizona and Utah and others that they can put in that window. I think ESPN may get clobbered here by Fox in some of those late night windows where they go head to head. Keep an eye on that because I noticed one of the very first, head to heads was coming up in a couple weeks. It's you have a BYU Kansas game going up against, some of these schools. And I kind of wondered, is ESPN going to have a little regret that maybe they would have been better off getting those Pac-12 schools and having, the Pac-12 schools plus San Diego State and having all those late night windows that they could have dominated in the Pacific time zone? Because I just don't know if games involving BYU and Kansas and, are those going to move the needle for viewers in the Pacific time zone, the 7:30 kickoffs later in the season. But I think putting Oregon twice and Washington twice in a 7:30 Friday night game, that's going to win. Like, those games are going to rate. So I think that's great. And then beyond that, you hit on it. I mean, the CW's getting into sports because last year the CW looked at the games they had. They weren't great games. They had kind of low level ACC games. They had Florida State once, but at the end of the year, they made a list. All right, here are our top rated shows of the year. The top 6 shows, Wilner, were football games. Like, it outrated everything else they did on that network, and Dennis Miller's no dummy. At CW, he went more football.
More football. That's right.
Washington State. And so everybody's doing it. And I think you're right. You hit on something with the Olympics. I mean, you can put it on anytime. People are going to watch.
You have just explained the existence of the Poulin Weed Eater Bowl.
That's it.
Even though that doesn't, the name has changed, but that's why there's 40 bowl games, 41 bowl games, because it does better for ESPN, the bowl games do, than anything else they could be putting on.
Yeah. Well, we are back next week with another great episode. We've got some big guests coming down the pipeline. Excited about Rivalry Week. You can read Jon Wilner at WilnerHotline.com. You can read me at JohnCanzano.com. If you're watching on YouTube, subscribe to this channel so you don't miss anything. Share it with your friends. If you're listening to the podcast, do the same. We'll be back next week with an all-new episode.
Thanks, everybody.